very insistent on that. It's funny. I'm actually going to open up my Bible today. All right, let's. Oh, and can you? Oh, this is on. Good. You're so smart. All right. Well, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to pick up this devotion kind of where we left off. We were in the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, and in Matthew's gospel, which is where we're going to base this devotion today, we're going to get not very far, which is okay. We're going to just kind of chew it up and figure out where we're going with this. But we're going to be in what's called the Beatitudes, the intro to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus really lays things out for his disciples, where it starts. And so we're gonna read just a few verses, and then we're gonna go over it together, and then we'll continue through that. And my plan is to get through this for the majority of the remainder of our devotion time. So you can expect that. Read ahead, all that stuff. So let's go ahead and dig right in. So this starts like this. We have chapter 5, Matthew. If you guys want a Bible to follow along, we have some over there. And here's what it says. And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And that's all we're going to get to today. But we're going to go through a few things here. One thing I did want to point out is that recently, I'm not sure if you guys have watched this or not, but the series The Chosen that's available to watch for free. I can't remember if we paid for it or not, but it's out there. I'm sure you guys have heard of The Chosen. But they've been building it up so that this Sermon on the Mount that Jesus is doing they're building it up. He's preparing for it. A lot of conjecture as far as how that goes down, extra biblical, like kind of in between the lines as far as what's going on in some of the scenes. But I really liked how he started it off and how he built up to this, because it's really an amazing work that Jesus presented to the world, and it's been recorded for us here. And we're going to go over these things so we can kind of understand what Jesus was talking about, because we talked about all the way up here stuff about how we have responsibility for sin and how that came into the world, and why it's here, and what what we need to do going forward, and how to live our lives in a certain way based on the standards that God set. Well, here's the Creator God here in the flesh giving us this insight on earth as he's living this perfect life, that he's just been tempted by Satan in the wilderness and gone through everything and can relate to us. We can relate to him. So he starts off and he gives us these what are called Beatitudes to kind of start us off. And so I'm going to go through them here together. Now, first thing I'll say, and we won't try this today, but typically the teacher would actually sit and the students would stand. And we've flip-flopped that all around in American culture. Everyone who's coming wants to sit, and the person who's presenting has to stand, hence the posture we have here. But technically, it says he went up and he was seated, because that's the position that the teacher would take. And so he goes to teach them, so they know he's in that position, so they're ready to hear what he has to say. And whether it's all built up the way the show does it or not, we don't know. But this is what he does. He was seated, his disciples came to him, and he taught them. He opened his mouth and taught them. And when it says he opened his mouth in authority. He opened his mouth to share something with them that was very important. And so this is what we get. And really what we're talking about with Beatitudes, it's about the internal qualities that are really required from a Christian, someone who's really converted, versus what they were dealing with in this day, which is the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the external works and the things that you had to do to make yourself righteous. And we talk about self-righteousness. It's really a false hope. You're never going to be able to do enough to be righteous. So what we're looking at is more what really the letter is looking at, what Jesus was calling for. And he's going to give us these attributes for someone, these qualities that you would possess as a true believer, as someone who follows Jesus Christ. Now, we don't typically, we have the word blessed It literally means happy. Happy is the man. We say bless like when someone sneezes. Americans use things weirdly. That's just the way it works. But what he's talking about is blessed in a way that's the purest sense. You get fulfillment and satisfaction from these attributes in their truest sense if you take them for what they're really supposed to be. You don't get that same fulfillment and satisfaction, on the contrary, or on the opposite end, when you do the things that the Pharisees are calling you to do, which is legalism and works-based and rules and things like that are really not what the intention was. So Jesus is trying to draw attention to that, separate that out, and give us a true sense of what a Christian would actually look like, and what those attributes would be. And so the first one, we're going to get through the two, like we talked about, we're going to get through two today. So happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So just looking at poor in spirit, I mean, first of all, we hate the word poor. Most of us hate the word poor, because poor is not, if you have a poor experience, if you are considered poor, those things are not desirable. But really, in this context and what Jesus is talking about, it's actually a good thing, and I'll explain why. If you're poor in spirit, it's really referring to more you're realizing your own helplessness and to fully rely on God. If you ever went to Sweet Frog, fully rely on God. So if you're fully relying on God and you're not relying on yourself, you're poor in spirit. You're not relying on your abilities. And so that's where you want to be, and that attitude that we're gonna talk about that in a second. There's a quote by a guy named Charles Spurgeon. I'm sure you guys have heard of Charles Spurgeon. Even if you don't know much about anything in the Bible, you've probably heard the word Spurgeon before. If you haven't, now you have. So what he said was interesting. I wrote this down. He says, "A ladder, if it's to be of any use, must have its first step near the ground, or feeble climbers will never be able to mount." I just thought that was an interesting thought. If you have a ladder and the first step is like 4 or 5 rungs up, it's going to be difficult to get there. So there's a process in which a Christian goes through, and we kind of talked about this, where you work your way through this developmental process that God takes you through as you develop and you learn and you grow. And so that is what's being talked about here. These are attributes that are not instantaneously perfected. There's things that you go through a process, and these are steps that you can take to assess yourself, if you will. And so this is what we're looking at. The poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is what everyone's looking for. They were looking for the kingdom to come. We'll even get into that when he's doing his prayer with them, your kingdom come, as on earth as it is in heaven. We've heard that before. So realizing who we are in comparison to God allows us to be able to receive this kingdom, like to truly receive it. We're not reaching out and grabbing the kingdom. We're not going to go out there and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and get that kingdom going. Like, that's not the way it's supposed to work. It's the poor in spirit. It's the humble. It's the lowly. That's the way. And he's going to get into that a little bit more later on. But that's what we're really looking at. We don't want to be thought of as poor in the sense of, weak, insignificant, useless. That's not the kind of poor we're talking about. We're talking about someone who's humble and realizes who they are and realizes who God is in comparison to that and realizes our dependence on him. That's what he's looking at. When you have that true realization, that's when you can have this relationship starting. That's the first step, realizing who you are. And we kind of talked about that in our other studies here. So one thing I did want to share in that, Paul speaks about this from personal experience in 2 Corinthians, and I wanted to share this. Chapter 12, verses 9 through 10. He said, and he said to me, he received this word from the Lord, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So thinking about that seems so backwards to us, just like this poor in spirit thing seems so backwards to us. You're supposed to go get them. You're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to be bold and do these things and go out and grab what you can and conquer the world. But the Lord's already conquered the world. You just have to get on with his way. You need to humble yourself and go in the spirit, in his spirit, right? So that's kind of what's being discussed here. And Paul had infirmities, he had issues, he had, just like all of us do. And he's like, you know what? I can look I can be weak physically, I can seem poor, I can be destitute, and yet I can be happy in that because I have the grace of God. I know where I'm going. I'm going to the kingdom. I'm going to be in the kingdom. So that's what he's talking about. So that's the first step, like Spurgeon said, this first step in the ladder, the rung, where you start things off. You got to have that mentality. If you don't start there, the rest of it's not going to build up very well. You're starting on the wrong foot, right? You're going to be starting on the fourth rung. It doesn't work that way. So that's why Jesus did it. And in his perfection, he started teaching just like this. So we can trust that. And Matthew recorded it in its seemingly in its entirety. So amazing thing that we have here. The second one, happy or blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And again, something that we typically would not want to accept. Like, I don't want to be sad. I don't want to mourn things. I don't, what does that mean? But then it says they shall be comforted. If you're able to mourn, if you're able to do that, then there's opportunity to be comforted in one sense. I also want to just point this out. It's in the sense, in the context, and in the way that we can kind of understand that the kingdom of heaven coming. Why did the kingdom of heaven have to come? Well, because of sin, because of fallen man. And so we can mourn that there's issues on the earth and that there was a need for a savior and that people are falling away, that people are lost and dying. And so we can mourn over that loss and what needs to be recovered and what Jesus came to restore. We can have a mourning process through that. There was a commentary I read that said that they recognize their needs and present them to the one who is able to assist. Those are the people that are mourning. When you recognize you have a need and you're kind of like, I'm at a loss, I need help. You present it to God and he's the one that provides. That's what's kind of being said here. Again, Paul, very popular author in the New Testament. He had a lot to say to all these churches and God used him mightily. Also in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 through 10, he said this, "For even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I perceive that the same epistle made you sorry, though only for a while. Now I rejoice that you were made sorry, but that your sorrow led to repentance. For you were made sorry in a godly manner, that you might suffer loss from us in nothing. For godly sorrow produces repentance leading to salvation, not to be regretted. But the sorrow of the world produces death." This is authentic sorry versus crocodile tears. When people are sorry they got caught and people are sorry for what they've done. Again, fundamentally understanding, like when you can mourn for what you've done and you can actually, in a humble way, step one, understand what you've done and you mourn for that. You long to have that corrected and you understand that the comfort comes that Jesus came and that Jesus died for your sin and that you will be in the kingdom. That's the comfort that's coming from the mourning. We're in an attitude that understands that we have messed up and we have to correct that, but we can't do it on our own. We have to rely fully on God, and he is the one that is going to be doing the comforting. And the other thing to consider is that you would have no idea about the awesome comfort that you have unless you understood the mourning. Just like joy and sorrow, it's that you have to have both ends to understand what they really mean. The depth of that wouldn't make it. If everything was happy all the time, how could you measure anything? Like, how happy are you? Well, on the happy scale, I'm a 10. Well, it was a 1 yesterday, but is that sad or is that happy? Well, I don't know, because there's no other side to compare it to. I have no comparison. So we have this comparison ability where we can say, well, I know how to mourn. I can weep with people. I can just understand where things are going, and then I can have this comfort that comes from that when I understand these things. And I'll end on this, right? We're heading towards this kingdom of God. This is our destination. That'll be the ultimate comfort. And 1 John 2:17, John says this, "And the world is passing away and the lust of it." We talked about that lust, right? "But he who does the will of God abides forever." And abiding is being in with God. It's kind of like living in a home with God if we're abiding with him. So again, the world is passing away. All the things that we focus on here, this world is passing away and all the lust thereof. But he who does the will of God abides forever. And these things we're going to cover are going to be in the will of God. It's what we're looking to understand from Jesus' teaching. So we'll stop there today. We got through these first two. We'll continue. But now we will turn it over to Morgan, who will turn on her microphone, and then I'll make sure the volume's up.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, guys, for coming. Just going to pray and we'll get started here with the lesson. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening, just for your word and encouragement and exhortation that you do comfort those who mourn. And I just pray, Lord, tonight that you would help us to be alert and able to learn and give me wisdom in teaching. Thank you for using the weak and foolish like me. Amen. All right. So tonight we're going to talk about aircraft systems and learn about some of the parts of the airplane and how different things function. Let's see. All right. No rush. Cool. I think tonight we're going to be watching quite a few videos because it shows kind of the function of different things. And then I'm going to have some questions that hopefully, if you guys want to interact, that'd be awesome, and like try and answer. It'll be stuff that will be covered in the video. Kind of answer some questions, ask some questions, touch on a few highlights of each video. So you can go ahead and play this first video.
Airplanes are made up of hundreds, even thousands of parts, from the simplest pieces of wood and fabric to newly designed composite airframes, to the most sophisticated of electrical components. Planes come in all shapes and sizes, but they all share the same basic design components. The basic components of any airplane are the fuselage, the wings, the empennage, the landing gear, and the power plant. The fuselage houses the cabin and cockpit to hold the pilots, passengers, and cargo. The fuselage is considered to be the central component of the airplane, since all the other components are attached to it. Most airplanes manufactured today use something called semi-monocoque construction. This means that underneath the skin of the airplane, there are a series of bulkheads and other supports that help hold the airplane together. As we'll be discussing in Lesson 3, Aerodynamics, the wings of an aircraft generate lift as air flows around them. The wings are shaped to maximize the amount of lift they produce. The wings can be attached at the top, midway, or at the bottom of the fuselage. Most planes have a single set of wings, referred to as a monoplane, but some planes have 2 or 3 sets of wings, referred to as biplanes and triplanes, respectively. The empennage, derived from a French word having to do with feathering an arrow, is commonly referred to as the tail section of the aircraft. It consists of 2 important surfaces, the horizontal and vertical stabilizers. These stabilizers are surfaces on the tail that help keep the airplane under control while flying through the air. Beneath the fuselage sits the landing gear, also known as the undercarriage. This structure is used to support the aircraft while on the ground. There are generally 2 different types of configurations, tricycle and conventional gear. Tricycle gear is so named because its wheel configuration resembles that of a child's tricycle. That is, it has 1 lead wheel near the plane's nose and 2 main wheels behind it, typically under the wings. Today, this is the more popular of the 2 types because it allows for easier landings and improved visibility while moving on the ground, also known as taxiing. Conventional gear, on the other hand, is the older style that was popular a few decades ago. Similar to before, 2 main wheels are typically situated under the wings, but the 3rd wheel is located under the airplane's tail. This results in the tail of the plane being very close to the ground, while the front of the airplane sits much higher. This obstructs the pilot's forward view because of the airplane's nose-high attitude. However, it does allow for larger engines and propellers to be installed on the aircraft. This setup is also the less stable of the 2, making landings more difficult, especially in a crosswind. Finally, there is the power plant, which in layman's terms is the engine. Airplanes can have 1 engine, called a single-engine airplane, or have multiple engines, called multi-engine airplanes. In most smaller general aviation aircraft, reciprocating engines are used like the ones found in cars. In many ways, however, airplane engines are simpler than car engines. The most basic of reciprocating engines on airplanes are not computer-controlled, are not liquid-cooled, and are not even fuel injected. If you're unfamiliar with those concepts, don't worry. We'll cover the basics of those topics coming up. With reciprocating engines also comes the requirement of a propeller. Just as there are different engine configurations, there are also different types of propellers. These propellers can range from the simplest two-bladed propeller made of a solid piece of wood to a complicated, multi-bladed propeller with additional built-in features. These features can include the ability to shed off ice or even to change the blade angle during flight. The rotating of the blades is similar in purpose to a car's transmission. So, there you have it. Those are the major components that make up an airplane. The rest of this lesson, we'll be going over in greater detail how many of the airplane's systems work.
All right. So, I guess I'm just going to go through a couple questions here that the picture shows. So, what is the fuselage? The fuselage is shown here in kind of a white color, and that's just the main body of the aircraft. We've talked a little bit about fuselage. I've mentioned these terms a little bit, but just so that we're all clear on the same page, I want to just touch on these. And of course, we have the wings, the landing gear, and power plant. And then the empennage. What is the empennage?
It's the tail of the plane.
Good job. Thank you. Okay, so they mentioned in the video two things that it includes. Does anybody remember? Two main components. Good. Yeah, the elevator, the horizontal stabilizer. Perfect. Can anyone remember the other one? That would be going up and down. Yep, the rudder and the vertical stabilizer. So kind of two main components. If you go to the next slide. Oh, yeah, I have it here, right here. So you've got, I forgot about that. So there you go. There's the answers. The horizontal stabilizer, the vertical stabilizer, the rudder, the elevator, and then of course your trim tabs. So that's kind of just an overview of the empennage. We've talked about all those control surfaces before, so I'm not going to get into them again. But this is just kind of an overview, big picture. Next. Okay, what's the difference between a tricycle gear and a conventional gear or tail wheel? Yes.
The tricycle landing gear has the wheel, one single wheel at the front, but the conventional one has the single wheel at the back.
Good. Yep. And so here we have there's the tricycle gear on the top left, conventional or tail wheel. A lot of people call it tail wheel. On the top right, the bottom left, up here in Maine, you've got ski. That kind of setups. So there's that, and then also float plane. So I just threw those in there because, but we're going to be talking about tricycle gear. The airplane that we fly, the Piper Warrior, is a tricycle gear. So that's the kind of airplane. It's more stable, a little bit safer to learn how to land in. Later on in your training, if you decide to get your tail wheel endorsement or your seaplane rating, you could do those things. But that's a little bit of a next step. So if you go to next. Okay, this is a bit of a longer video, but it's going to talk about the engine. So you can go ahead and play that.
We've just learned about the basic parts of an airplane and how it is controlled. But it's equally as important for us to understand how the power is generated to move the airplane through the air. An airplane has an engine, which is commonly referred to as a power plant. The reason behind this name is simple. The engine not only powers the airplane to move it through the air, it also has other components attached to it in order to create electricity, vacuum suction, and heat, just to name a few. The power plant of an airplane, like an engine of a car, is one of the most important components, because without it, there is no way to get the plane off the ground. Aviation engines can be separated into two groups: reciprocating engines and turbine engines. While most airlines and corporate airplanes use turbine-powered airplanes, general aviation and training aircraft are equipped with reciprocating engines. Reciprocating engines have several cylinders. Inside, air are mixed, compressed, and then ignited. As this fuel-air mixture is ignited, its explosive force moves the piston inward. These pistons are connected to a crankshaft, and when the pistons move in and out, that causes the crankshaft to rotate. The propeller is connected to the crankshaft, so as the crankshaft rotates, so does the propeller. The cylinders undergo a continuous four-stroke cycle. The four strokes are called intake, compression, power, and exhaust. The first stroke, the intake stroke, is when the piston inside the cylinder moves away from the cylinder head. As the piston moves away, the intake valve is sucked into the cylinder's combustion chamber. Once the piston has reached the base of the cylinder, it's time for the second stroke, compression. During this phase, the intake valve is closed and the piston reverses direction, moving back towards the cylinder head. This compresses the fuel-air mixture since it has nowhere to escape. Once the piston approaches the top of the cylinder, we begin the third stroke, power. Two spark plugs at the head of the cylinder each let off a spark, which ignites the fuel mixture and makes it combust. This controlled explosion pushes the piston back inward towards the base of the cylinder, which in turn rotates the crankshaft, and therefore the propeller. Finally, we reach the last stroke, exhaust. During this phase, the exhaust valve opens, and the piston moves back towards the cylinder head, pushing out the combusted gases, commonly called exhaust. Then, the process starts all over again, repeating the process thousands of times every minute. On a typical four-cylinder engine, each one of the cylinders is in the middle of a different stroke. That way, one cylinder is always in the power stroke, and the engine is able to keep the crankshaft rotating, thereby allowing the remaining cylinders to go through their respective stroke. As we just saw in these four strokes, there are two valves at the head of each cylinder that open and close to allow the fuel mixture in and the exhaust gases out. But what controls those valves? That would be a camshaft. The camshaft is a rotating cylinder situated above the crankshaft with various oblong lobes protruding from it. These lobes push on rods that connect to each valve, pushing them open. The valves are spring-loaded and will return to the closed position as the camshaft lobes move away from their respective rod. Getting the valves to open at the exact moment is very crucial for the engine to operate. Because of that, the camshaft is geared to the crankshaft so they will remain synchronized. The camshaft is geared to spin half as fast as the crankshaft. This results in the valves opening twice during the four-stroke cycle. Cylinders. The fuel, on the other hand, is housed on board the plane, typically inside of the wings. Just like the air, it is metered and then sent to the cylinders. There are two different potential systems used that can control the fuel-air mixture: the carburetor system and the fuel injection system. Most modern airplanes are equipped with fuel injection systems, so we'll spend a little more time on that, but it's a good idea to still review the basics of a carburetor. The job of the carburetor is to mix fuel with the air that gets sent to the cylinder combustion chambers. Fuel arrives at the carburetor and sits in the float chamber, waiting to be used. To the side of the float chamber is the venturi, which is where the air passes through. As the air passes through the venturi, its velocity increases, which causes the pressure to decrease. Towards the bottom of the venturi, we find a fuel discharge nozzle, which is located near the area of low pressure. This draws the fuel out from the float chamber through the nozzle and mixes it with the air. Just past the venturi is the throttle valve. This controls how much of the fuel-air mixture is being sent to the cylinders. In newer airplanes, fuel injection systems are installed, which have many benefits over carbureted engines. Fuel injection engines reduce the amount of fuel required, increase engine power output, and allow for the precise use of the fuel. Rather than having a carburetor, a fuel-injected system is split up into different components. These consist of fuel pumps, a fuel control unit, a fuel manifold valve, and finally, fuel discharge nozzles. The fuel pump pumps fuel from the fuel tanks into the fuel control unit. Then, the fuel control unit regulates the specific amount of fuel needed based on the mixture and throttle settings. The fuel then gets sent to the fuel manifold valve, where it is dispersed and heads to the nozzles of each cylinder. This time, the fuel does not mix with the air until immediately before entering the combustion chamber. Now that we've discussed how we get fuel and air into the cylinders, let's talk about how we get that mixture to ignite. The ignition system is what provides the spark to the mixture. The major components of the ignition system include the magnetos, the spark plugs, wires, and the ignition switch. Just as its name implies, a magneto consists of a rotating magnet that generates sparks of electricity. The spark that is generated is independent of the airplane's electrical system. That means if the airplane's electrical system were to fail, the magnetos would still be able to generate sparks for the engine to run. The energy generated from the magnetos is sent to the spark plugs. The spark plugs then release that energy, which ignites the fuel-air mixture, creating power to turn the propeller. Most airplanes have 2 magnetos, multiple sets of wires, and 2 spark plugs per cylinder in order to increase efficiency and reliability of the system. If one magneto fails or one spark plug fails, the engine will still run. However, power output will be slightly reduced as the engine is operating less efficiently. The last component is the ignition switch, which is the pilot's way of controlling the magnetos. In most general aviation aircraft, the switch is labeled off, right, left, both, and start. If the switch was to be placed off, then the magnetos would not be able to power the spark plugs. Therefore, the engine would not be able to run and it would turn off. If the switch was placed in the right or left position, then only that respective magneto would be powering its spark plugs. If the switch was positioned on the both selector, which is its normal position for flight, both magnetos would be powering the spark plugs. Finally, the start position. This engages the starter, which turns the crankshaft to start the engine. In the cylinders, the spark plugs ignite the fuel-air mixture, moving the piston in the power stroke. However, there are a few abnormal conditions that can affect the performance of the engine. The first one is called detonation. Detonation is the uncontrolled explosive ignition of the fuel-air mixture inside of the cylinders. It results in high temperatures and pressures, which can cause cylinder damage. Detonation can happen for a variety of reasons, including using a lower grade fuel than what is recommended, high power settings with the mixture set too lean, or climbing too steeply with cylinder heads not cooling appropriately. If detonation is occurring, the pilot should reduce the power and increase the mixture, which will allow for better cylinder cooling. Another issue that can develop is pre-ignition. Just as you'd expect, pre-ignition is simply when the fuel-air mixture is ignited prior to its normal time. This phenomenon usually occurs because of a lingering hot spot on the cylinder wall, usually caused by a carbon deposit that is hot enough to ignite the fuel-air mixture. Even when the engine isn't detonating or experiencing pre-ignition, the temperature of an engine can get quite hot. Like car engines, airplane engines have a cooling system in order to prevent engine damage or engine failure. There are 2 major ways we cool our engine: oil and air. Oil passes through an oil cooler and proceeds to not only lubricate, but also cool the engine. As the cool oil touches the hot engine, there is a heat exchange, meaning that the oil becomes warmer, but the engine cooler. Then the oil returns back to the oil filter and oil cooler, and the process starts over. However, we also use air to cool our engines. As the airplane flies through the air, outside air flows through inlets usually found on the front of the airplane like the Cessna 172. This outside air is colder than the engine, so as the air flows over the engine, it cools it in the same manner that the oil cools the engine. This method of cooling can be severely restricted, however. When the airplane is running at high power and at very low speeds, such as when climbing, airflow is minimized, causing higher temperatures. The last step in the four-stroke cycle is the exhaust. The exhaust system has a dual purpose in most general aviation airplanes. As expected, the exhaust system does allow the hot exhaust gases in the cylinder to escape the engine in a quiet manner. Additionally, as we'll talk about later, the exhaust system also provides heat to the cabin. Now that we have a better understanding of how an engine basically works, we will examine what creates the thrust for the airplane to fly. Remember that as the combustion occurs in the cylinder, the pistons rotate the crankshaft, which directly drives the propeller. The propeller, when closely examined, is actually twisted. This is simply to create equal thrust along the propeller blade. Since the propeller rotates around its hub or center, the further the propeller extends out of that hub, the faster it spins. To create equal force throughout, manufacturers twist the blade. There are two major types of propellers: fixed pitch propellers and constant speed propellers. The Cessna 172 is equipped with a fixed pitch propeller. This means that the pilot cannot manipulate the propeller blade. It is installed onto the airplane and will always remain exactly how it was installed. An airplane equipped with a fixed propeller only has the throttle to control the engine RPM and therefore propeller RPM. A constant speed propeller, such as the one on the Diamond DA-42, is more efficient than a fixed pitch propeller. With a constant speed propeller, the pilot can adjust the blade angle of the propeller to obtain maximum performance for different conditions of flight. Airplanes with a constant speed propeller are not only equipped with a throttle, which still controls the power created by the engine, but they are also equipped with a propeller control. This control, which is usually blue in color, allows the pilot to change the RPM of the propeller instead of just based on the engine's output. The reason this propeller is called constant speed is that when throttle movements are made, the RPM, or speed at which the propeller is rotating, will remain the same. This is accomplished by rotating the angle of the blades, which allows them to deflect different amounts of air.
All right, that covered a lot of stuff. So let's touch on a few of the things that that video talked about. Who can tell me what the power plant is?
The engine?
Yes, good, thank you. The engine, all its components. Here I have a picture of, well, a couple pictures. This is kind of a typical four-cylinder airplane engine, and as you can see, this is kind of looking at it from the front. The propeller would be attached right here on the front, and we call the cylinders are set up like two and then two behind on each. So there's four cylinders total. So there's two on each side, and they're horizontally opposed. So sometimes different airplane engines will have the cylinders, like sometimes they're in like a circle or like different designs, V shape in some cars. And so ours, we say they're horizontally opposed. That just means where the cylinder is located on the engine. They're like just horizontally opposite one another. Okay. Next slide. I think. Okay. What are the two? Do you guys remember the two main types of airplane engines? Yes.
Reciprocating and turbine.
Good. You're like taking notes. Thank you. Yes, reciprocating or propeller engines and turbine, we call them a lot of times jet engines. So this is a picture of a jet engine. We're not really going to talk about them much. We're mostly going to talk about propeller engines, but this is like a picture of what it looks like if you're curious. You can go to the next slide. We are going to talk about reciprocating engines, so. Can anyone, well, it's on there if you look closely, can anyone name the 4 different strokes of a reciprocating piston engine?
Well,
Go ahead.
the last two are power and exhaust.
Power and exhaust, okay, yep. Can anyone remember the first 2? Intake and compression. Thank you. So in order, it's intake, compression, power, and exhaust. And if you look here, this diagram, this one just shows like kind of the components of a cylinder. And then on the right side, you've got the intake, the compression, the power, and the exhaust. So who knows which of the 4 strokes is responsible for turning the crankshaft and the propeller? Okay, you have an answer. The power stroke, yeah. So, and I wanted to say, kind of mention something. The video said the power stroke is a explosion, but really, and he said a controlled explosion. Really, you could think of it, it's the fuel and air is burning inside, and that's what's causing that. And the reason why that's important is then, I'll mention that in a minute, why that's important. So, but the power stroke, the fuel and air mixture is burning, and that creates a force moving the piston back and forth. All right, what does the throttle control do? This is an easy one, guys. Come on. Yeah.
It controls the throttle.
The throttle control?
It controls how much fuel and air mixture goes into the engine.
Precisely, yep. The throttle controls the amount of fuel and air going into the cylinders. What does the mixture control do?
It controls the ratio between fuel and air.
Right, so you're mixing fuel and air together, and then you're sending it into the engine. So the mixture controls the ratio, the throttle controls the amount total that's getting into the engine. Okay, so he talked about fuel-injected and carbureted engines. Our airplane has a carbureted engine, so we're going to talk about that a little bit more. I think you can go to the next slide, maybe? All right, what is the purpose of a carburetor? Any ideas? Vivian? Yep, the carburetor mixes the fuel and air together, so that's the component of the engine that does that. Here we have a diagram of it. I think the video did. Does anyone have any questions on the carburetor? Yes. The ball is like, it's a little float that's inside there that basically measures the amount of fuel in that little compartment there. So it helps regulate the fuel. So then it's attached to this little like thing right here where fuel is allowed to go into there. So when this fills up, the ball goes up and it closes off this little like fuel inlet, so that it keeps about approximately the same amount of fuel in that compartment at all times. Pretty much, it helps regulate the amount of fuel that's in there. So, any other questions on the? Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's probably on there, but I can't read it.
It's okay.
So, when you're adjusting the throttle, the fuel-air mixture that does not go to the engine that's diverted or whatever, where is it going if it's not going to the engine?
When you're adjusting the throttle,
Yeah.
so it just restricts the amount. It's not like it's diverting it to somewhere else. It just
Okay, so it's flowing on either side to the engine, and if you close it, you're just getting less flow. Okay.
right. So it just restricts the amount of. So this is the throttle butterfly valve. So as it opens, that air and mixture can more freely flow through, and as it closes, it just restricts it from flowing through. Good question, though. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. We can go to the next. We're going to talk a little bit about the magnetos. This is a kind of a diagram of them, and what do the magnetos create? Okay, go ahead.
Sparks that create the explosion, which creates the
Yes, the spark that ignites the fuel-air mixture. Good. And how many magnetos do airplanes usually have? Okay. Two. Do you know why? Does anybody know why?
if one fails, then the other will still power it.
Yes, thank you. So if one of them fails, it's for redundancy. Okay, you can go to the next slide. All right, so what are detonation and pre-ignition? Or what is detonation? We'll start with that. Yes.
Explosion.
Right, the fuel oil mixture explodes instead of burning properly, which is usually caused by, does anybody know? Okay. Yeah? Why?
Fuel intake before the compression. I think.
Uh,
Or was it really taking notes?
no, that's okay. It has to do with, one of the causes has to do with the fuel. That was close. Yes.
Was the, when part of the tube gets hot, like it's hot, so it explodes it?
You're thinking pre-ignition, which is where it can anyone, well, yeah, so basically pre-ignition is, detonation and pre-ignition are two different things. So the detonation is where the fuel air mixture explodes instead of burning in a controlled way. Pre-ignition is where the fuel air mixture is ignited at the wrong time. So you were right in, that was a good description of pre-ignition. So detonation is usually caused by like the wrong type of fuel, using the wrong type of fuel in the airplane, or as he was saying, like the engine's getting too hot. Pre-ignition is cause it showed that picture of like the red hot on there. That was a great description, and is caused by like carbon buildup or something in there that's creating a spark other than the spark plug at the right time. So if you go to the next picture, I'm not sure. Okay, what are two ways that the airplane's engine is cooled? Okay.
The air,
Yep, that's one of them.
the oil.
The oil. Good. Our airplane engine is cooled two ways, by engine oil and then air. So we would call the airplane, the type of engine, air cooled, but we know that it's also being cooled by the oil. All right. I don't know if I have a picture for this, but you can go to the next slide. No, I don't. That's okay. You can leave it there. How is heat brought into the airplane's cabin? I don't know if the video actually talked about this. Yes, thank you. I wasn't taking notes apparently either. I know I wrote this based on the video, so like I must have been in there. Yes, so there's a shroud around the exhaust. And I don't have a picture, so I'll just give you a quick drawing of it. So basically, you have like the engine here. This is a very rough sketch, by the way. Here's your propeller. And then the exhaust is fed out through pipes, okay? So in order to bring heat into the cabin, what they do is they take air from outside, and then they have this little thing that's around the exhaust pipe called a shroud. And basically, the exhaust pipe gets really, really hot. I don't know if you guys have ever touched an exhaust pipe. Don't do it. It gets really, really hot. It'll burn you. Very bad, actually. So the exhaust pipe is really, really hot because it's taking all that heat from the engine. It's dumping it out through that exhaust air. So, but if what they do, the designers of the aircraft make a shroud around it, which is just like a little compartment where air can flow around the exhaust pipe without actually touching the exhaust air. So it's like separate from the actual exhaust air, but it's just going around the exhaust pipe and then absorbing some of that heat. And then they take that and they feed it right into the cabin where the pilot's sitting. And so that's like the system they use. Is a pretty simple system that is efficient. It's using some of the heat from the engine that they're just trying to dump out of the airplane anyway for something useful. So that the reason why this is important is because if there was a crack in the exhaust pipe, now the exhaust from the engine is going to mix with the air that's being put into the hot air that's being put into the cabin to heat up the cabin, and there's a potential for carbon monoxide poisoning. So that's kind of what that's about. We'll get into carbon monoxide poisoning another time. But just kind of put that in the back of your mind there for later. Okay. On an airplane with a fixed pitch propeller, what control on the flight deck changes RPM? The RPMs, they're the propeller spinning, how fast the propeller is spinning. Vivian? The throttle, thank you. It was an easy question. Some of these are simple, but thank you. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Oh, okay. We have a video, so we can go ahead and play that and then talk about it.
The carburetor is a simple and reliable device. It mixes air and fuel in the correct ratio for internal combustion of an aeroplane engine. As air is sucked into the engine, firstly it passes through the air filter. It then flows through the carburetor's narrow section, called the venturi. At this point, the static air pressure falls and fuel is drawn into the airstream. The mixture enters the engine cylinders for combustion and flows out of the exhaust as hot gas. If you are old enough to have seen a carburetor in a motor vehicle, you may be wondering why the aeroplane's carburetor is mounted upside down and below the engine. One advantage is to prevent the engine from flooding with excessively rich mixture. Any surplus fuel simply flows down out of the system. Another advantage is that if the carburetor was mounted on top of the engine, the pilot would have a good view of it, but would not see what's in front of the aeroplane. A typical training aeroplane's carburetor is susceptible to ice forming in the venturi. Ice can restrict the airflow and possibly stop the engine. You don't even need to be flying through a snowstorm for the ice to form. Even on a warm day, if there is moisture in the atmosphere, it can form into ice inside the carburetor. The temperature of the air drops dramatically in the venturi because the static air pressure drops. The air temperature drops some more because fuel that is drawn into the airstream evaporates. Just like the sweat that evaporates off your skin to cool you down, so does the air inside the carburetor. Ice is most likely to form at low engine power. At a low power setting, the carburetor's butterfly valve is nearly closed, which means that the temperature drop is significant because the venturi effect is significant. A low engine power setting also means that the normally hot engine block is cooler. Therefore, the attached carburetor is cooler. These factors combined create the perfect recipe for ice to form. Ice formation in the carburetor can be observed by rough engine running, lowering of the engine power, and subsequently a total engine failure. So how can you prevent carburetor ice from forming or remove it once it's already formed? The engine's hot gases pass through the heat exchanger before they exit out of the exhaust. By switching carburetor heat on, the airflow is redirected through the heat exchanger where its temperature is raised. The warmer air flowing through the venturi prevents ice from forming, or it can melt ice away if some had already formed. Since hot air is less dense than cold air, the engine power drops when carburetor heat is applied. If ice is present, the engine power will drop initially, then increase considerably once ice is gone. The engine may experience momentary rough running as the melting ice is ingested into the engine. You must apply carburetor heat only as directed by the pilot's operating handbook applicable to your aeroplane type. Generally, carburetor heat is not used on or low to the ground because the heated bypass air is not filtered to remove contaminants from the airflow. carburetor heat should not be used for extended time, as it can overheat the engine and even burn a hole in your exhaust.
All right. Okay. So can anybody tell me how carburetor ice forms? It's caused by kind of two different things. If you could tell me one. Yeah, go ahead. Exactly. The lowering of the static pressure in the venturi of the carburetor, that restricted area. Just like when we were talking about a wing and how when the venturi in the narrow area, the pressure is lowered, though the temperature also is lowered as well. And so the air cools down basically. Then also you have evaporation, which causes a cooling of that air as well. At what engine setting is carburetor ice most likely to form? Low settings, yep. Because if you have a high power setting, the engine is going to be real warm. But if you have a low power setting, the engine is not going to be as warm. What is one indication? Well, there's kind of two. What is an indication of carburetor icing? Can anybody?
Like the engine being shaky and rough.
Yeah, running rough. Good. There's another one.
Engine failure.
Potentially, it could lead to engine failure. Yeah. Yep, you're going to see a loss of RPMs. So, good. Thank you, guys. When should carburetor heat be used? Vivian? Yeah, when your pilot's operating handbook prescribed you to use it. Also, anytime that you suspect there's carburetor icing, you want to put it on. And so sometimes the manufacturer recommends that you use it on takeoff, landing, and maneuvers. Well, not takeoff, but landing and maneuvers. I gotta edit that. Landing and maneuvers, sometimes they'll have you use it because it's a low power setting. But our airplane, the Piper Warrior, they don't recommend you use it unless you need it to prevent like if you're flying through conditions that could potentially cause carb icing, or if you have carb icing. So, but some airplanes have you use it on a regular basis when you're doing certain maneuvers. Some airplanes don't, and ours doesn't have you do that. So it just depends on the design of the aircraft. One thing to note, because of the lower temperature in the carburetor, the lower temperature of the air, carb ice can form at temperatures as high as 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not, of course here on like a freezing day when it's like 20 degrees, you're like, oh yeah, of course carburetor ice might form. But because the temperature gets cooled so much, the temperature of the air gets cooled so much in the carburetor, even if it's like 70 degrees out, if there's moisture in the air, and it can potentially, you can have carb icing. So just keep that in mind. If you're flying along and it's like 65 degrees, you might not suspect it normally, but there is still potential there. Okay, you can go to the next slide. All right, a few more short videos, guys. So thanks for bearing with me. You can play this one.
After learning about how the engine works, we remember that there are two things that are mixed together for combustion: fuel and air. Let's learn some things about the fuel system. The fuel system is designed to bring fuel from the fuel tanks to the engine. In general aviation airplanes, fuel systems can be broken down into two subsystems: gravity-fed systems and fuel pump systems. High-wing airplanes, such as the Cessna 172, are normally designed to be gravity-fed systems. Because the fuel tank is inside the wing, which is located above the engine, gravity can naturally pull the fuel from the tank to the engine. Although, in normal operation, a fuel pump is not required, many high-wing airplanes are still equipped with some sort of fuel pump, either an engine-driven, electrically powered, or both, as a backup for emergency operations. In low-wing airplanes, such as the Piper Arrow, a fuel pump is required to send the fuel from the tanks to the engine. Since the fuel is located below the engine, it is simply impossible for gravity to send the fuel upwards. For this reason, low-wing airplanes are designed with a fuel pump system. Normally, there are two fuel pumps. One of the fuel pumps is engine-driven, and the backup is electrically driven. Some airplanes are equipped with a fuel primer. The fuel primer allows fuel to be injected straight into the cylinder prior to engine start. Fuel priming is especially useful during cold operations. While some airplanes are equipped with a fuel primer, others like the Cessna 172 are not. However, we'd still like to enjoy the benefits of priming the engine. Therefore, it is possible to prime the engine of the Cessna 172 using the electric fuel pump. Fuel is stored in fuel tanks, which are usually located inside of the wings. These tanks are filled from the top. There is a cap on the top that is easily twisted off, and gas is pumped into that tank until it is visually full. This cap is usually vented to allow outside air pressure to enter the fuel tank in order to prevent a vacuum from being created inside of the fuel tank. If the fuel tank did not have a vent, fuel would initially flow from the tank, but as it empties, there would be nothing to replace that space, which would create a vacuum and eventually stop fuel flow to the engine. Therefore, manufacturers vent the tanks to allow air to replace the fuel that is leaving the tank to the engine. Some airplanes not only have vented fuel caps, but they also have fuel vents that protrude from the wing. As the airplane flies through the air, air enters this vent and is pushed into the fuel tank. Also inside the fuel tanks are fuel sensors. These fuel sensors send information to the fuel gauge, which shows the pilot the amount of fuel in the tank. These sensors work in many different ways depending on the manufacturer of the airplane. It is absolutely critical to visually verify the amount of fuel in the tank. Never entirely trust the fuel gauges. After visually verifying the quantity of fuel in the tanks, it's also equally important to confirm that there are no contaminants in the fuel, such as water. The fuel tanks are equipped with fuel sumps or drains. The pilot uses a special fuel sump cup that allows fuel to flow out of the tank and into the cup. At that point, the pilot visually verifies that there are no impurities in the fuel. Most general aviation airplanes utilize 100 low-lead fuel, which is blue in color. Therefore, not only should the pilot check for impurities, the color of the fuel should also be inspected to ensure that the proper fuel was pumped into the tank. Another component found in the fuel system is the fuel selector. The fuel selector usually has 4 different positions, but some manufacturers may have fewer positions. The 4 positions are left, right, both, and off. If the fuel selector is in the left position, then fuel is only drawn from the left tank. Similarly, if the fuel selector is in the right position, then fuel is only drawn from the right tank. In normal operation, the fuel selector is in the both position, which allows fuel from both the left and right tanks to be sent to the engine. In the off position, fuel cannot pass into the engine, which stops the fuel flow to the engine. Ordinarily, the fuel selector is only placed in the off position in an emergency situation, such as an engine fire. The Cessna 172 only has 3 positions on its fuel selector: left, right, and both. A fuel shutoff valve is instead used to shut off the fuel supply. This valve is located just above the fuel selector and can be activated by pulling on the knob.
So he was talking a lot about the Cessna 172. We have a Piper Warrior, so a little bit different. So on low-wing airplanes, like our Piper Warrior, what type of fuel system is typically used? Yes. Good, fuel pump system. And on an airplane with a fuel pump system, like our Piper Warrior, there are 2 fuel pumps. Does anybody know how each of them receives power to function?
One receives
Good. Engine-driven system versus an electrical fuel pump. Very good. Okay, where are the fuel tanks typically located in a small general aviation aircraft? Perfect. Yep, there'll be one fuel tank in each wings. Yeah.
Question, what's more reliable, a fuel pump driven system or a gravity system?
I don't know. It depends on the design of the aircraft. So,
I know gravity never fails me.
yeah, yeah. The one thing with a gravity fed system is, like if you're in a bank, for a long time the fuel can actually flow from one wing to the other. So like there's benefits and disadvantages of both. With the fuel pump system, they put 2 fuel pumps in for redundancy to make it more safe. So I don't know that one is particularly more than the other, but I suppose that would be a matter of opinion. Okay, can a pilot rely solely on the fuel gauges to determine how much fuel is in the aircraft?
It should be checked visually.
Perfect. Yes, you should always, 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 always check visually before you go and fly. I use the fuel gauges to confirm what I already know about how much fuel I have. That's what I use the fuel gauges for. I don't use them to find out how much fuel I have. I use them to confirm what I already know. When should a pilot check the oil level visually? Anybody have an idea?
Every time I start the engine.
Yeah, every time you want to start your engine, exactly. When you're going to fly, you always want to check your oil level before starting the engine. When should a pilot check? So you have 2 gauges. You have your oil pressure and your oil temperature gauge inside the airplane. When should you check those? Check your gauges. Does anybody have an idea? Go ahead.
Continuously.
Yeah, throughout the whole flight. So as soon as you start up the engine, you want to check your oil pressure gauge to make sure that there's oil flowing through the engine. If the engine doesn't have any oil, if we didn't have oil, the engine would tear itself apart because the metal parts all hitting one another, it would just tear itself apart. So, which wouldn't be a good day. So we want to make sure we have oil as soon as we start the engine, oil pressure and temperature, and we want to check those as we go through the flight. Go to the next. Okay, that was the fuel tank. I kind of forgot about the slide, so keep going. Oh, and I got into the questions. You guys were answering questions without even seeing the video. Good job. All right, so you can go watch the video.
As we've discovered, an airplane's engine cannot run without fuel. Another valuable fluid that is required for the engine to run is oil. We've already discussed how the oil cools the engine, but other equally important functions of oil is to lubricate the moving parts of the engine, provide a protective coating to prevent corrosion, and remove dirt and other particles from the engine. There are 2 types of oil systems, a wet sump system and a dry sump system. A wet sump system, like that of a Cessna 172, is a system in which the oil is located in a tank at the base of the engine. This makes it an integral part of the engine. On the other hand, a dry sump system has a separate oil tank, which separates the oil system from the engine. Let's take a journey through the oil system of a typical general aviation airplane. As oil leaves the sump, it is routed through a strainer screen, as to not allow any solid contaminants to flow through the system and damage it. After leaving the strainer, it passes through the pump. Leaving the pump, the oil is then routed into either the oil cooler if it is hot and needs to be cooled, or it bypasses the cooler if it's already cool enough. Next, the oil proceeds to the oil filter, which removes any contaminants that made it through the strainer. Finally, the oil is sent to the engine for lubrication, cooling, and cleaning. When the oil has finished its journey, gravity pulls it back to the sump. Since oil is so important for the engine, it's imperative to check the oil level prior to flying. The minimum and maximum amounts are specified in the airplane's flight manual. While flying, it's also important to regularly check oil pressure and oil temperature. Anything outside of the normal range, which is usually designated by a green arc, may potentially lead to major problems, including engine failure.
Okay, we already talked about checking the engine oil level during the pre-flight inspection, and then here's your example. You can have the gauges look different depending on the airplane you're in, but example of a temperature and a pressure gauge for your oil in the airplane. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, let's talk about, I think this is the last video, about the electrical system. So you can go ahead and play this.
The electrical system provides electrical power to many different systems, from some flight instruments to aircraft lights to flaps and landing gear. The electrical system powers them all. The electrical system is usually comprised of a 14-volt or 28-volt direct current or DC system, made up of some basic components. These consist of an alternator, a battery, switches, circuit breakers or fuses, relays, a voltage regulator, an ammeter or load meter, and the electrical wiring which connects it all. Let's study some of these components in more detail. Similar to a car, the alternator is driven by the engine through an alternator belt, which generates electricity for the entire system. The alternator is the primary means of powering the electrical system during normal operations with the engine running. Not only does the alternator provide power to the electrical system, it also charges the battery. The battery is mainly used to start the engine or to power the equipment while the engine is not running. In cold weather, the battery capacity can be severely reduced, so it's important that the pilot conserves battery power. The electrical system is protected either by circuit breakers or fuses. Most modern airplanes are equipped with circuit breakers instead of fuses because they are resettable. A circuit breaker pops when there is excessive voltage, which results in high heat in the electrical wire. Fuses are not the popular choice today. Although they work similar to a circuit breaker, once a fuse burns, it must be replaced, and that electrical circuit will not be complete until that fuse is fixed. Circuit breakers are usually grouped together in the cockpit by the bus they are located on. Not the bus that brings you to school, but an electrical bus. An electrical bus is like a power strip. You can plug multiple things into a strip, and if you turn that strip off, everything plugged into that strip will not be powered. In an electrical system, the same remains true. The components of an electrical system are usually divided into multiple buses. For example, there may be a main bus and an avionics bus. On the main bus, main equipment such as lights are powered, and on the avionics bus, most of the instruments and equipment to run those instruments are powered. While there may be one electrical bus or many, the entire electrical system needs to be powered safely in order to prevent a possible electrical fire. In order to do this, a voltage regulator and alternator control unit work to monitor and control the electric system. The voltage regulator will allow the alternator's generated power to charge the battery and power the system with an acceptable voltage by stabilizing the output of the alternator. Finally, the pilot can monitor the electrical system by either an ammeter or a load meter. An ammeter shows the performance of the electrical system. If the alternator is providing sufficient power to the electrical system and is charging the battery, then the ammeter will show a charge. If the alternator is not charging the battery, or the battery is being used because the alternator has failed, a negative indication can be seen on the ammeter. A zero indication simply means that it is neither charging nor discharging the battery. While an ammeter shows electrical performance of the alternator in relation to the battery, a load meter shows the load that is being placed on the alternator. So if the alternator's load is 40 amps, then the indication will show 40. If the load meter shows 0, then the alternator is either off or has failed. If the alternator fails in any electrical system, the battery will provide power, but not for very long. Depending on the airplane and if there are any backup batteries, an alternator failure may require a diversion from the planned flight.
Okay. There's kind of two functions of the alternator. What are the two main functions? Does anybody know? Or one of, yeah.
To power the stuff and to charge the battery.
Perfect. Yep, powers all the electrical equipment and it charges the battery. What is the function of the battery? Go ahead.
Serves as a backup for the alternator.
Yep, it's a backup for the alternator. It also has another function that the video mentioned. Does anybody remember? Yep, it's starting the engine. So the battery, since the alternator runs by the engine, the alternator is running when the engine's running. When the engine's not running, we need another source of power. And so to actually start the engine up, we use the battery. Okay, this wasn't exactly covered in this video, but how can an airplane engine continue to run even if the alternator and battery fail? This is kind of connecting some dots from maybe an earlier video. Does anybody know or have a guess? Go ahead.
Magnetos produce power and then rotate.
Right. So the magnetos are what's actually creating the power for the spark plugs, and that is separate from your alternator and your battery, which creates electricity for, your electronics, your instruments, and that sort of thing. So kind of two separate systems, and it's designed that way so if you do lose your alternator and your battery, you won't have electric equipment, but your engine will continue to run, which is a good thing when you're flying along. So, okay, that is all I got. Wow, finished 1 minute early. That was not planned, but okay. Anybody have any questions? Now that I've asked you guys all the questions. Yes.
Are there reminder things, or you have to remember all of this, or are there some reminders or alarms or anything? Seems like a lot to remember, or is it kind of like when you're driving a car, or it just starts to happen automatically?
Like if something were to go wrong, you mean?
Well, there's just a lot of things you're saying, like, okay, you need to be regularly checking, this or that, and before you get on, you check this. Is that something that just a pilot, by the time they're actually flying, they've had enough, practice and reminders that it's natural, or are there some, kind of like in a vehicle where there's like, oil change or gas,
Yeah.
I can answer. There's a checklist for every airplane.
Okay.
Yep.
So you like when you're going to get on it, you do the
It's not a
checklist.
plastic card. And
Yeah, you have checklists for just about everything.
Okay.
You do. So you can, like, in case you don't remember or, I don't know, to do it anyway, you can look at the checklist and go along.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep. That was a good question. Yep. Any other questions? Trip over the thread. Yeah.
With the two fuel tanks, say in the Cessna 172, it's gravity fed.
Yes.
Is the rule of thumb to use both tanks and drain them equally at the same time, or does it matter?
Yeah, generally you're going to fly, okay, so there's different types of fuel selectors. I'm glad you mentioned that because the Cessna 172 has a fuel selector that has a selector for right, left, and then both. And generally you're going to keep it on both and run from both. But for some reason the design of the Piper Warrior, it only has three selections. It has a right, a left, and then an off position. So you can only feed from one tank at a time. So you either the left or the right, which just means that you have to keep track of the time and switch the tanks back and forth as you're flying along. So about every 30 minutes or to an hour or so, you would switch tanks back and forth as you're flying along. I don't really know why they designed it that way. It's just the aircraft manufacturer decided that they didn't want to put a both selector on, so not sure why. But our airplane just has a right and a left and an off. It doesn't have a both. But if you did have an airplane that had a both, that would be the preferred selection. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Does that have an impact on operations when you're unevenly distributing weight with fuel?
Yes, actually it does. So if you drain only from one tank, that wing is going to be lighter, and so you'll actually just be like in a very slight constant turn that you have to correct for, which I've experienced. So, yep. Any other questions?
Does having a heavier right wing help with left turning tendencies?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I've never tested it before. But that's a good thought, that having the right wing to be heavier might help with the left turning tendencies. Yeah, I don't know. Anything else? Okay. Well, we'll end there. You guys are welcome to snacks. Thank you all for coming and hanging in there. And that's all I got.